Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it gives me great joy and pleasure to rise, obviously, in this House to talk about a very important piece of legislation, S-216. I do, at the outset, want to talk about the Budget Implementation Act because the budget, because it claimed to want to have the spirit of the S-216 within the budget and the eventual Budget Implementation Act. Unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, it's fallen a little bit short. It is too prescriptive by nature, but as is my nature, I want to be positive. So I'm going to talk about 216 and the positive that it has. And perhaps maybe members on the government are listening and they can look to amend the BIA to encourage and enlist some of the great positive characteristics about 216, such as a focus and responsibility on accountability, transparency, and support for our charitable sectors instead of depending on form like the BIA currently does. Why not focus on substance like S-216 does? So, like I said, I am an eternal optimist, Mr. Speaker, and I'm hoping that members of the government will listen to this speech and hear some of the positive characteristics of S-216 and perhaps amend the BIA to include some of those positive characteristics. But before I get into the substance of the speech, I also have a big thank you. This legislation, of course, comes from the upper house, the Senate, being S-216, and it is brought by Senator Ratna Omnivar. Senator Omnivar is a tremendous asset for Canada. She is working night and day, tirelessly trying to help the people of Canada, and S-216 is the latest result or work product of her tireless efforts. And so a big tip of the cap to the Senator for her fabulous work in helping the charities, nonprofits across Canada. So thank you very much, Senator, for drafting this bill and allowing myself to present it. So let's get into the legislation and the context around it. So currently, the Income Tax Act, which is over now 3,000 pages, and anyone who's heard my speeches before knows I do believe it is due for an entire overhaul and a review. But this particular legislation that we're going to talk about, it talks in the Income Tax Act. It talks about the fact that charities have to do their own work. It says carried on by the organization itself. This in itself is not a bad thing. Obviously, we want to make sure that charities are accountable and responsible for their resources, because they, of course, get benefits from the Canadian taxpayer. When you write a check or you give a deposit, I dated myself there, Mr. Speaker, by saying check. But when you make a donation to a charity, of course, you get a receipt, and of course, the coffers of the government of Canada are reduced. And so we have to make sure. The challenge is the language is that having own activities is a challenge because it creates operational decision making, not in the hand of a nonprofit, but in a charity. So let me explain what that means. So it says direction and control. So anytime a charity gives money to something called a non-qualifying donee, and no one outside of the charitable sector probably knows what a non-qualifying non-qualifying donee means. That means anyone the charity that is giving the money to that is not a charity in itself. And so what this legislation says is, if in fact a charity wants to give resources to a nonprofit organization, they have to have direction and control. Operational control. So let's put that in real terms, Madam Speaker. So if in fact you are a large charity, let's say the Red Cross, the Canadian Red Cross, then they want to give proceeds to an organization, a nonprofit, perhaps in Haiti, helping build schools or something fabulous like that. They are subject to an incredible amount of legislation and bureaucracy, which makes it extremely difficult for those organizations to do work. this is a contrast with around the world. It's actually referred to in international development circles as the Canadian problem. It inhibits and limits the ability of Canadian charities to do great work to help folks around the world. So to contrast this, other jurisdictions have taken a much different approach. While we are still putting operational control in the domestic charity, and we are still putting form over substance, other jurisdictions have said, you know what, let's look at this in a reasonable, rational way. Of course we want those charitable dollars going to go where they're supposed to help people around the world or domestically, but we want to focus on substance and not just on form and bureaucracy. So in the United States, for example, foundations can give grants to foreign entities provided those foundations maintain what they call expenditure responsibility. In the United Kingdom, charities may transfer funds to foreign partners provided those funds are used exclusively for the charitable purpose. So you can have pre-grant due diligence. So to put it back into that example, instead of a Canadian charity basically having to take over a nonprofit NGO around the world, meaning that they have to approve the smallest of decisions, they say, you know what, we need a contract up front, so we need to make sure that the nonprofit is legally required to stay within the charitable purpose, and then there are certain due diligence. So it's accountable, but there's not that takeover. Right now, it requires Canadian charities to educate their project partner and stand in the position, and they have to tell their project partner, imagine this, Madam Speaker, you're a Canadian charity and you want to work or partner with a nonprofit or NGO around the world, and you say, you know what, Canadians want to help, we want to help your organization, but to do so, you're going to have to be subordinate to us. And that means this consumes time and resources that could otherwise directly go to the charitable project. It also invites errors, increases the compliance risk to Canadian charity. An overseas partner communicating to the charity from the granting program, this creates evidence that CRA could question as being a non-qualified donee. So in other words, in layman's terms, it creates more and more bureaucracy and paperwork that takes away from what the charity is starting to do, and of course what we want those charities to do, which is to help people in Canada and indeed around the world. So what does Bill S-216? It creates the concept of resource accountability. It is, once again, substance over form. We, of course, want to make sure that charities in a transparent, accountable way are partnering with nonprofits and NGOs, both at home and around the world, in a way that makes sure that the end users, the recipients of this, are the beneficiaries of these great actions. But right now, unfortunately, way too many of those dollars are not vulnerable people across the world and in Canada. They are lawyers, they are accountants, they are professionals who are there to try and administer it, because currently our charitable structure for allowing partnerships both domestically and home is way too bureaucratic. And so S-216 has this resource accountability, which I said puts form over substance. There has to be that due diligence, that accountability, and that transparency. But instead of a morass of paperwork, of a takeover of Canadian charities, of organizations, it allows a true partnership to occur. Restraint. And you can imagine that there are specific communities where this could be even more challenging. I would point to, of course, the Indigenous communities. Of course, we all know about the troubled history that the Canadian government has with Indigenous communities. So the way that it currently works, the way the Income Tax Act is worked right now, is that if a foundation or a Canadian charity wants to work with an Indigenous group or even a First Nations, they will have to put the Indigenous group in a subordinate position. And they said, given the history that we have as a country, one can more than understand the issues that Indigenous communities would have with that. This legislation would help vulnerable people, would help people in challenging situations, those economically otherwise challenged. Specifically, groups that this would help would be, as I mentioned, Indigenous peoples, members of the LGBTQ community, BIPOC communities, and Canadian overseas charity. There is nearly unanimous support for this legislation across the charitable sectors, and stakeholders have been very outspoken in talking to us. I'd like to give a specific example, if I can, Madam Speaker, with respect to a group and how the current state of the Income Tax Act is disadvantaging charities and nonprofit organizations. This group is called Make Way. Make Way's shared platform provides operational support, governance, and charitable expertise for change makers so they have more time to do what they do best, which is, of course, help people. The Income Tax Act, the way it's currently structured, requires that Make Way only undertake projects where those projects are its own, as evidenced by its continued direction and control. So these groups, operationally, this means that all project teams are Make Way Charitable Society employees, contractors, that Make Way retains all ownership of work product, that all projects adhere to Make Way policies and procedure, and that every legally binding document, they have to be a signatory to, which means leases, contracts, funding agreements, proposals are all signed by the Make Way shared platform director. And that Make Way also approve every press release, even every social media. So to understand the legal fiction, the direction and control it creates, is that if these nonprofits want to go on Twitter to talk about something, they need to get approval from the Twitter. They need to get approval from the Canadian charity. This may be worse than the Liberal Party in terms of their control. A little bit of humor there. A little bit of humor. And so that every single contract has to be approved. As a result, Make Way Charity holds all fiduciary governance and human resource responsibility is at their own liability and risk. So you can understand the pressure, the barriers for there. If I could just get a time check, Madam Speaker. 2.5 minutes. Okay, perfect. And so that is one significant example. Another example I'd like to talk to you was actually I had Tanya from Black Moms Connection come into my office, and I was so thoroughly impressed. To give a little bit of Black Moms Connection and Tanya's story, she saw that there was an issue, that there were some Black moms out there that were struggling to get by, and so she put out a Facebook group, and they grew from 400 to 4,000 people. And so she recognizes that in this community there was a tremendous need and vulnerability, and Tanya, she didn't just sit around, she didn't write a letter, she got right into action. And so she formed a non-profit. And since then, her online village has grown to almost 30,000. It has helped hundreds of Black families across Canada, from emergency grants to buy formula, rent, to providing emergency support for rent and mortgage, to providing COVID protection, to providing financial literacy programs. She is literally responsible for helping thousands of the Black community come up through society, of clinging on to that first ladder of economic success. She is doing an absolutely tremendous job working around the clock to help members of her community, and I was just so thoroughly impressed. The challenge is, with the way the ITA, the Income Tax Act, is currently struggled, is she cannot receive money because it's overly burdensome from charities. So her funding streams are greatly restricted. And this story is out there 1,000 different times. We need to have sensible legislation, which S-216, which puts respect back to our charitable sectors so that we can empower them to do their great work, not limit them by needless bureaucracy. So let's put substance over form. Let's put right over wrong. Let's come together as a House and pass this legislation. Thank you.